for a very fruitful session. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Amita Paliwal to say a few words.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Professor Mukhia.
Good morning.
So I, on behalf of History Department and Dastan, the Art and Architecture Society of Jesus and Mary College, formally welcome you, sir. In fact, we all the professors who are present here, they will agree with me that we all have grown up in our academic career listening to Professor Mukhia's name. And I'm sure for my students, it's going to be an absolute pleasure to listen to a professor whose name they have just been reading in the books. So, good morning, Professor Mukhia, once again, and without wasting much time, I'll hand over to start your lecture on the evolving contours of the discipline, the past and present of history. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Amita. Thank you, Srishti. Thank you, everyone. Srishti, you got one fact wrong. I did my PhD right from BA to PhD in Delhi University, not JNU. There was no JNU at the time. JNU came much later. Anyway, so I'm also actually it's Delhi University, which is my alma mater, not JNU. JNU I joined as a teacher. Anyway, that's just by the way. Well, friends, it's a pleasure to come and interact with students who are probably a quarter of my age. Students are, young students are so, young people and students particularly are so full of fresh ideas that it's always good to interact with them, get fresh insights. We old fogies, our ideas get frozen with age, and I think it's always good to give a prick to these old ideas that students can provide. So it's always good to interact with young students. It enlivens you up greatly, refreshes your ideas, and I think begins to, compels you to think over again. So thank you very much for inviting me to your college, which, as I told you, is also my own daughter's college. She graduated from JMC long ago. Anyway, come to the point. Let me say that two kinds of, caveats. Initial caveats. One, that this is a lecture meant for undergraduate students, and therefore one can't really expect highfalutin philosophical abstractions in this lecture. In any case, I am myself very uncomfortable with philosophical abstractions anyway. So we'll be talking about more of less of abstractions than of the empirical part of the evolution of history as a discipline. And the second is that I'll be talking of, since we are covering a huge distance, enormous distance in this lecture, I'll be talking of, sort of, conceptual solidarities, that is to say, large concepts, Each concept is an entity, but each concept also has many dimensions of it, Like anything, like positivism or Marxism or anal historiography or anything, postmodernism, any of these has many dimensions. It's not one. Positivism is not one. Marxism is not one. And so on and so forth. So each one of these has many dimensions. In fact, in history, the language itself is such that it has many dimensions. You just cannot consolidate. I mean, you do consolidate for the sake of argument, but you still keep in mind that this consolidated notion also has many dimensions. In the sense that anything, state, empire, war, nationalism, feudalism, all of these are, one word sort of denominations, and yet they have many dimensions. So therefore one uses a a consolidated concept in some context and uses and elaborates the dimensions in another context. So I'll be using these as single terms rather than going into their dimensions, because, as I said, we are covering a huge distance in this. Now, we historians are very proud of saying that history is the oldest discipline. History is the mother of all disciplines, and for proving that history is the mother of all discipline, we go back to Herodotus, the 5th century Greek historian Herodotus, called the father of history, and so on and so forth. So history has a very long history behind it, very long past behind it, which is true. But the title of today's conversation is History as a Discipline. History as a discipline doesn't have such a long past. It has just about 200 to 300 years past, as a discipline, and I'll be talking about how it evolved as a discipline. It's really from the 16th century onwards that in Europe, elsewhere earlier, but in Europe, in 16th century onwards, that history begins to evolve. Some of the ingredients of, some of the elements, some of the constituents of what we know as history. Therefore, it doesn't really have such a long past, and if that hurts a bit of our pride, still we have to take into account that history is a very recent discipline, though it's a slightly older discipline that other disciplines like sociology. Sociology is very, very young, or even economics and political science and so on and so forth. But, Herodotus, what he wrote was histories. Histories is a term that is used for him. But he mentions that what he is collecting is tales and traditions. These are the words that he uses, and therefore his tales and traditions have become history. In other words, it's entirely impossible to verify that the histories that he has passed on to us as empirically true or not, right or wrong. It's not possible to verify. There is no means of verifying what he is telling us is actually history. So because he himself says it's tales and traditions and so on. But Herodotus and so many others, Greek historians, from which the tradition comes, one characteristic of these historians which is a very valuable characteristic, is that their explanations are rational explanations. Whatever they are explaining is not in terms of divine will and God had willed it so, and and so on. Extraterrestrial, extra worldly explanation. None of them gives that. All of these are rational explanations, and therefore it was this rationality of their explanation. They haven't propounded any notion of rationality as later on Renaissance and Enlightenment did. But nonetheless, these are rational explanations, which later on in Renaissance and Enlightenment, etc., they invoked that rationality in order to counterpose it to what they call the dark ages of medieval age in Europe. So it was this rationality that was later on invoked by Renaissance and Enlightenment and so on. So this one facet of their historiography or their histories or tales and traditions, whatever, or what has been passed on to us as history, this notion, this aspect of this facet of rationality facet of it should be kept in mind. That these are rational. Why should it be kept in mind? There is a particular reason why it should be kept in mind. Because once we come to medieval period, the so-called medieval, these are all of these are constructions of historians, ancient period, medieval period, modern period, These are not realities, you see. I mean, in the sense that until about 17th century, 16th or 17th century, there was nowhere in the world was history divided into ancient, medieval, or modern period. The concept of periodization itself is a very late development in history writing. So that Europe, and this is European invention, periodization. In the 17th century, particularly, those started a little earlier. So that periodization is a concept which comes along, and what we call medieval period. Two developments took place. Two major developments took place. Particularly in the 4th century, Saint Augustine, he wrote this book, The City of God's City, the City of God. By city, he meant the world, in which he gave twofold framework of history. One fold of it was the history is a universal entity. It's not the history of this region or that region or this period or that period. It's history as such. History is one single unit, and it's universal. All history is single universal history. That's one facet of history that he gave. And the second facet of history was he gave a very large historical explanation, comprehensive historical explanation. And the comprehensive historical explanation was that all history happens as an unfolding of divine will, God's will. Nothing happens in history except for God's will. Something which we still recount not in history but in everyday life. Bhagwan jo chahta hai wahi hota hai, So this explanation of history in terms of God will, this is a unitary explanation, a single explanation. There is no other aspect to an explanation of history that it happens as a result of divine will, providential history. Now, why is it so? One, that it began to shape the discipline. These two facets of history began to shape the discipline for the next few centuries. And in a way, very interestingly, these two facets of history, one, universality of history as a single entity, and B, a universality of a single explanation of history, this continued into its ideological adversaries, and the ideological adversaries of this theological explanation. What were the ideological adversaries? For example, positivism, or even more emphatically, Marxism. Nothing can be, no ism can be more antithetical to providential kind of explanation of history than Marxism, isn't it? And yet, just look at Saint Augustine told us that all history is a single entity, universal history, and there is one explanation, namely divine will. Marxism tells us all history is a single unit, single entity, and it has a single explanation, namely class struggle. All history is the history of class struggle, says Marxism. That's central to Marxism, isn't it? And yet, if you look at it, the two features of Marxist history, namely all history is one history, and B, all history is explained in terms of one single explanation, namely class struggle. These are the same parameters that Saint Augustine had given, though the meaning of those parameters has changed quite clearly. It has changed, but the parameters remain the same. So that this Saint Augustinian kind of historiography, history, or sorry, not historiography, historical explanation or discipline, if you like, is still not discipline as we understand it, of history as such, remained in a way pervasive. It's still in a way, in some ways, pervasive. So medieval Christianity, they gave a new turn to history, which was very distant from the ancient Greek history writing that Herodotus, etc., had given us. So there is a very sharp turn there. Now, in the medieval period, history was called rhetoric. It wasn't even called history very much, called rhetoric. So you can understand rhetoric doesn't have that any kind of discipline or that kind of strict discipline. It's very malleable, you know. Any rhetoric is very malleable, very flexible. And therefore, medieval history, though written in terms of divine will and so on and so forth, it remained very flexible in the sense that when they describe the events, they describe, in the end, they say it all happened because of God's will, but the description of events is very varied kind of description of events. Now, but there is no in this history, there is no concept of, what shall I say, concept of authenticating the narration of events. You know, the events that you are describing, are they authentic? Did they really happen? How can we check? How do we prove or check the authenticity of these events? There is no way of. In fact, not only is there no way, there is not even a concept of checking the authenticity of these events, you know, that they are describing. So that the concept of history as a rhetoric remained without any verification, without even a concept of verification of these. Therefore, there is no need for verification. There is no need because history is as it is, because very respectable people have told you so. You record events and you accept them as authentic because very respected people have narrated these events to you, or these are the respected people are the source of your knowledge of these events, and therefore you accept them as it is. Now, the 16th century onwards in Europe, 16th century onwards, two developments began to take place. They concretized in the 17th century particularly, but 16th century, two French historians, François Baudouin and Jean Baudin, these two French historians, towards the end of the 16th century, or late in the 16th century, they developed the notion of sources of history, that there are sources of history from which you derive your information. And these sources are of two kinds, the primary sources and the secondary sources, something that any research student is immediately, or even an undergraduate, you must also have been introduced to primary sources and secondary sources. This notion of primary sources and secondary sources, in which the primary sources have a primacy over secondary sources, this notion develops in the 16th century at the hands of these French historians, but it began to spread. And therefore, the notion of checking the authenticity from the primary and secondary sources, that notion began to develop. In the 17th century, the notion of chronological sequence of events also began to develop. which lends authenticity to an event that you are narrating. If you establish the chronological sequence of the occurrence of that event, that lends authenticity. One of the sources of authenticity or authenticating the event that developed in the 17th century and so on. So that a new a kind of discipline of history began to develop in the late 16th and 17th century in Europe, which laid some boundaries to the study of history, namely, particularly the boundaries of A, checking the authenticity of events, and B, checking them with sources, and C, checking these sources with a bit of skepticism. Just because sources tell us, we don't accept it. You check even the sources, the authenticity of sources. You begin to check. Therefore, a kind of methodology of history writing began to develop in the 16th and 17th century. One of the reasons why it developed then was that they had started codifying Roman law. Until then, Roman law was there at one time in the Roman times, but then after that it sort of receded, and it began to give way to customary law and customs and so on and so forth, which are necessarily vague. And therefore, Roman law began to be revived and codified. And while codifying, they realized that there are all kinds of interpretations being given to Roman law. At every time there is an invocation of Roman law. It's a different kind of invocation than the preceding invocation, and so on. So that Roman law, they began to realize, had many meanings. Why did it have many meanings? Because each meaning developed in a particular context. In one context, it was interpreted in one way. In another context, it began to be interpreted in another way. So that its meaning began to change with the context. And therefore, the concept of context came into the study of history. When you study the authenticity of an event or a source, you also study in what context did it happen, and in what context was the source compiled or the source originated, and how did it change. So what we take as granted today began to develop only in the 17th, from the 16th century onwards, in the 17th century, and in the 17th you have periodization coming in ancient, medieval, and modern towards the end of in 1788 to be precise. So that history began to acquire some kind of the notions of a discipline, the parameters of a discipline. It began to acquire. Now, it went on till the 18th century. It went on developing, but the major break, even in this, first itself, it was a major break. 16th, 17th century was a major break, but 19th century was a break that still remains with us. 19th century, it became a discipline by the 19th century. Only in the in Berlin particularly, it became a discipline in the early 19th century. How did it become a discipline? What made it a discipline? Well, one young historian, then young, Leopold von Ranke, German historian, Ranke wrote a book. What was his book? This one, yes. The History of Latin and Teutonic Nations. The History of Latin and Teutonic nations, he wrote in 1624. More than the book, the preface to it has remained not only live but very relevant down to this day, and I'll be talking about it for a little bit of length. What was the preface? He in this preface he said history is supposed to teach us about the present and shape the future, etc., etc. I would not go into that. It's not for me. It is not important. I have recorded history as it really happened in this book. He was 29 years of age still. History as it really happened. This phrase of his, history as it really happened, became sort of the most influential definition of history as a discipline. By then, they had established departments of history in universities, particularly Berlin University, professors of history. So it had become a discipline in the universities. And therefore, a kind of professionalization of history began to take place. But coming back to this, history tells us as it really happened. This phrase of his, brief phrase of his, defined history. What does history? In what way history tells us as it really happened? He doesn't say historians tell us as it really happened. He says history tells us as it really happened. How does history tell us as it really happened? History tells us because he says historians' knowledge may be faulty, their understanding may be flawed. So it's not historians who tell us, it's history tell us. How would history tell us? The history will tell us, the point of the historian today is to collect facts of history. Go on collecting facts of history as he had done in his book, Teutonic, in his book, Latin and Teutonic Nations. Just go on collecting facts. Don't judge them. Don't interpret them. Don't generalize anything from these facts. Just go on collecting facts as they are. And one day, when all the facts of history will have been collected, that is when history will tell us as it really happened. The emphasis is on two. One is history as it really will tell us, and two is as it really happened, the reality of happening. In other words, there can be no doubt about what really happened. There are no two opinions about. There would be no two opinions about what really happened. There would be only one opinion about what really happened. This is taking cue from they called it scientific history. The view. This is also what is called. This is also what is called objective history. Scientific history, positivist history, empiricist history, positivist history. There is a difference between empiricism and positivism, but it's quite often used synonymously. So that all of this has come from science. In the natural sciences, there is no uncertainty about the conclusion. There would be uncertainty about the process of research. But once a research has been verified, there are two aspects to it. One is that science is universally valid. A formula of science is as valid in New Delhi as it is in New York and in New Zealand. And B, that it is verifiable universally. So it's true. It's true universally. It's the same thing with history, with social sciences as they began to develop, sociology particularly, but history. So when you know that when you have collected all the facts of history, and when history tells you as really happened, there will be no doubt left about it. There will be no ambiguity about it. It will be just like a natural science. So that's why they called it scientific history. positivism began to descend into the social sciences, in economics, political science is called science, sociology, and so on and so forth, and in history in this manner. So what is the meaning of this, of the facts that Ranke wanted to collect? The meaning of facts is that facts are as objective, historical facts are as objectives, are as objective as natural, the facts of natural sciences. So objective facts, you go on collecting objective facts which are there in the archives, which are recorded in the archives. So all you have to do is to go to the archives, collect those facts, and go on collecting those facts. Don't interpret them, just collect them, and you'll end up with this history, which will tell us as it really happened. So that this notion of scientific history became very popular, became the universally accepted, to begin with in Europe and later on in the rest of the world. It began to be accepted everywhere, as scientific history, as objective history, as objective facts, etc., etc. This is how it began to develop, and this is what still remains with us. Now, is just one second. Now, is history really as objective a discipline as a science is, as a natural science is? Is it possible for history to be objective? I mean, Ranke told us not to interpret historical facts at all because they are objective. But there were other grand theorists like Montesquieu, like Voltaire, like Adam Smith. Adam Smith is an economist, but actually he has contributed as much to history as to economics. So that all of these are propounding very grand theories, very, very big theories, which also touched upon history. So there is a kind of tension between the Rankian kind of history that which is not to be interpreted, which is only to facts to be objective facts to be collected, and the grand kind of explanation of historical processes and so on and so forth. Now, so there is a tension right from the beginning itself. But this tension began to erupt later on in the 20th century, starting 19th century, but in the 20th century particularly, early 20th century began to erupt. Namely, Benedetto Croce, who was a Italian sociology, grand Italian sociologist, he also introduced a phrase, a statement, just like Ranke had said, history tells us as it really happened. Benedetto Croce said, all history is contemporary history. It's a fantastic statement. It's a wonderful statement. How is all history contemporary history? How can all history be contemporary history? History is a past, contemporary is the present. How can it be? It is contemporary history because history, when today you study 16th century, you study 16th century in the 21st century. You are studying 16th century with questions that have erupted in the 21st century, that have come to your mind in the 21st century. Questions that you raise are questions, they are the products of your mental equipment in the 20th century, not in the 16th century. So the questions that you are putting to Aine Akbari, for example, or Akbarnama or anything else, the questions that you are putting to Akbarnama are not 16th century questions. They are 21st century questions. And that is why the study of Akbarnama, 16th century document Akbarnama, in the 21st century becomes relevant to 21st century. So it has so anything that you study, any period of history, any aspect of history, any theme of history, any region of history that you study in a particular period, it becomes relevant to that period when you are studying it, as much as it is relevant to the period of which you are studying it. So that all history is contemporary history means the meaning of history changes, the questions that you put to history change, and therefore the meaning of history begins to change. Once again, the question of context becomes relevant here. As the context changes from 16th century to 18th century to 21st century, the meaning of history begins to change. The significance of history begins to change. And therefore, that strict, very tight definition of history that Ranke had given us, facts, objective facts, that began to become malleable, that began to become flexible, that began to give different meanings rather than one single meaning as Ranke had anticipated. And therefore, the boundaries of history begins to get a little fuzzy rather than as tight as Ranke had suggested. Then let me pause here for a while to bring in some other traditions of history writing. We are talking of European traditions so far. We keep on talking of European traditions so far because that's the dominant tradition anyway. So we have to talk about it. Excuse me. But there are other traditions also. Islamic tradition, for example, although it's a much younger tradition, history came to the Islamic world with Islam itself. Prior to Islam, there was no notion of history in the Arab world. So Islam brought a new religion and a new concept of history to the world. Now, this concept of history is very interesting that right from the word go, this history has a notion of an implicit notion, not an explicit notion, an implicit notion of verification of facts. And this implicit notion is given in two manners. One is two modes. One is chronology. There is history in Muslim history, as Rosenthal called it, a history of Muslim history. This Islamic history or Muslim history has a very strict. It's called abjad. It's a mode of every letter of Arabic has a numerical value. Alif has the numerical value of 1, Bay has the numerical value of 2, and so on and so forth until the last letter has the numerical value of 900. So that when you are writing something, when you are narrating an event, in this year this happened, this event happened, etc., etc. When you are narrating an event, you also coin a phrase or a verse in a manner that the numerical value of the letters of this verse or phrase give you the date of that event. For example, the Babri Masjid, which was demolished so mercilessly. By the way, The claim that Babri Masjid stood on the ruins of a Ram temple, or Ram temple was demolished in order to build the Babri Masjid. This claim has not been accepted even by the Supreme Court. Historians didn't accept it, but the Supreme Court also didn't accept it. They still gave away the land to Ram temple, but the claim they did not accept. In fact, the Supreme Court said that there was no demolition that had taken place. But that's just by the way. So Babri Masjid, the Mir Baqi who built the Babri Masjid, he coined this term, Buwad Khair Baqi, Buwad Khair Baqi. Buwad Khair Baqi, if you add the numerical value of this Bay and Wow and so on and so forth, Buwad Khair Baqi in Persian, then it gives you the date of the construction of Babri Masjid, the equivalent of the Christian, the AD equivalent of which is 1528. So, or you often see this 786 written behind scooters and so on and so forth, three-wheelers and so on and so forth. 77 cent, instead of say Bismillah or Rahman or Rahim, you write 786. So it has that. So this abjad, as it is called, abjad is used to reinforce the chronological location of every event, which is a form of authenticating that the event did take place. That's number one. And number two, and this is long before the European world woke up to the notion of authenticating events. And number two, there is a concept of isnad. Isnad is, though it's mainly in religious history, theological history, but nonetheless, isnad is you get information from X. And then you take that information from X source, or let's say you get your information from source A. You take it from there, but then you begin to check where did A got its information, his or her information, or its information from. A got it from B. You then begin to check where did B get its information, etc., etc., until you reach the origin of that information, the original source of that information. Now, it's still not always very authentic to establish the authentic. It's not very rational to be able to establish the authenticity of even from the. It can be false at the origin itself, but the notion that you must seek to authenticate an event, that notion existed, which developed in Europe much later. And the Chinese also had a very strong tradition of chronology, chronological sequence of events. So that, there are many traditions of history writing, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Islamic and Indian and so on and so forth. There are many traditions of history writing. All of these traditions were one European tradition, Rankian European tradition, was superimposed on all of these traditions, and one single tradition began to become universal. It became universal not because of its intellectual superiority, but because of the relation of power. As Europe expanded into the rest of the world, its arms, its trade, its politics expanded to the rest of the world, but also its intellectual concepts also expanded to the rest of the world, and they become universal. Jack Goody has this marvelous book called The Theft of History, how various notions of time and space and history, various notions that existed, they were stolen by Europe. Theft of history is what he calls, stolen by Europe in the 19th century. And one single notion, we all use one single reference point of chronology, BC AD. Now it is BCE and CE and BCE. But, the term has changed, but the basis remains the same. So that no other temporal unit is used for locating your chronological event of in history anywhere in the world. And we all still write history in the many of us still write history in the Rankian mode of objective history, scientific history, as it without any alleged interpretation of it. So that the notion of scientific history remained intact. Now, then come at the same time came Annales Historiography, the French journal Annales Historiography. Annales was founded in 1929, the journal. That introduced 2 or 3 major alterations in the Rankian scheme of things. The major modifications that they introduced were, one was what they call history in its entirety. Rankian kind of history has one limitation. When you go to the archives and find your data in the archives, what kind of data would you find in the archives? The only kind of data you'd find in the archives are the kings and queens and their battles and administration and so on, and nobles and so on and so forth, The essentially dynastic history, political history, that kind of history, Very little other data is ever recorded as stacked in the archives. So the history that you write becomes essentially history of kings and queens and dynastic history, and at the most a little bit of court history and so on, so history of the courtiers and nobles and so on and so forth there. So it's a very limited kind of history. Annales Historiography immensely widened the scope of history. They called it history in its entirety. It's wrongly translated into English as total history, but it's history in its entirety. Everything has a history, and therefore it should be encompassed in the study of history. So there is an enormous expansion of the scope of history, far beyond kings and queens and so on and so forth. The history of society, history of economy, history of ecology, history of rainfall, history of how is rainfall determined? For example, 1,000 years ago, how is rainfall determined? How can you know the history of rainfall? The history of rainfall is, if you cut a tree, when you cut the tree with anything, you will find rings, various kinds of rings within the stem of the tree. Rims are sometimes very narrow, sometimes wide, sometimes they are brown in color, sometimes they are little more brown in color, less brown in color, sometimes they are even blackish. So what are these rings? Why are the rings so widely different in the tree when the tree is not chopped, when it is cut with a kind of blade? Why is it? What explains that? What explains is the rainfall. When the rainfall is heavy, the ring would be thicker. When the rainfall is on the low side, the ring would be less thick. So when the ring in the tree, it's called chronodendrology. The scheme, the notion, the science of finding out the rainfall, the amount of rainfall through the cutting of trees is called chronodendrology. Is also called dendrochronology. So that you begin to find the amount of rainfall 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago. So that, the history of disease, the history of the family, history of women, all of these, everything came into within the scope of history, with the expansion of history into the totality of history, or history in its entirety. That was one. The second was the notion of facts of history. The objective fact of history began to be altered. Lucien Febvre, one of the two founders of Annales Journal, called these facts the idolatry of facts. Facts are not objective facts. Facts are recorded by somebody who is a human being, and therefore his own biases, his own assumptions, his own perspectives come into the very recording of facts. So the recorded facts are not all that objective. They also have a meaning embedded in it. And therefore you have to have the imagination to unearth the meaning recorded in these facts. What you might call it bias. I don't call it bias. It's a perspective that goes into the recording. Therefore, every historian writes a different kind of history with the same facts. So that the facts become facts and interpretation. They are no longer separable. They are part and parcel of the same thing. A fact is also an interpretation. Itself is an interpretation. What we call medieval history is medieval history a fact or an interpretation? It is an interpretation. It was also called Hindu period and Muslim period and British period. Hindu period, British period, Muslim period, British period. Is it a fact of history or is it an interpretation of history? So that facts are not objective facts, as objective facts as Ranke had assumed. Thirdly, they introduce the element of imagination, a great amount of imagination into the writing of history, into understanding of history. It is through imagination that you begin to unearth the meaning of these facts and so on and so forth. And therefore, with this expansion came the enormous kind of expansion of the sources of history. The archives tell you about the political history, dynastic history, etc., etc., etc. What would they tell you about the other aspects of history, like family history, history of the family, history of dreams, history of filial relationships, history of love, history of friendship, and so on and so forth. So other sources, many kinds of, not many, but any kind of source. Lucien Febvre again had said, for the use of history, for the study of history, facts, yes, but all kinds of facts, and not, I'm sorry, I put it wrong. Texts, yes, but all kinds of texts, and not texts alone. Not texts alone. That's a crucial thing. There are many other things which explain, which are important sources of history than merely text and so on, and archaeology and so on and so forth. Folklore, folk tales, the surviving mindsets of people, the anthropological investigation of the values that are inherited by societies, by communities, by families, by groups, and so on and so forth. Memory, society's memory, our community's memory, our individual's memory of what had happened. Place names, even the size and design of tombs. All of these become sources of history. The literature, painting, all of these become sources of history. So vast expansion of the scope of history, vast expansion of the sources of history, and vast expansion of the meaning of history that took place. Uh, uh, and thirdly, they introduced a different mode of the structure of or the hierarchy of historical causation. There are many causes for the occurrence of any event, but there is always a hierarchy of some cause becomes more important than other cause. Marxism had taught us that there is a very given hierarchy of causes. Political, yes. Political sentiment, yes. Philosophy, yes. This, that, yes. But in the ultimate analysis, in the last instance, this is Engels' words, in the last instance, it is the economy which explains everything. There is a last instance explanation, which is economy. Anal historiography introduced a different kind of structure of causation, or structure of hierarchy of causation, namely a flexible structure, a flexible hierarchy in which there is no given last instance explanation. There are moving conjunctures of these hierarchies. At some point, my favorite example to explain this is Bangladesh, the creation of Bangladesh. In the creation of Bangladesh, economic factors were important. Bangladesh was being exploited. Political factors were important. Bangladesh had a majority of population of then Pakistan, and yet power rested in the hands of what is now Pakistan, or then West Pakistan. But what led to the Bangladesh movement was the language, the question of language, the suppression of Bengali language. So in that conjuncture of historical causes, language becomes acquires primacy. Politics and economy also are important, but they are of a lower order than language. So and sometimes economy becomes important, sometimes politics becomes important. So they introduce a flexible hierarchy of causal hierarchy, moving conjunctures, as I said, of causal hierarchy rather than a given conjuncture. Now, finally, let me, I have about a couple of minutes now left. Today, we are faced with not one objective history, but not one sort of meaning of history, but many meanings of history. Plurality prevails today. Does plurality mean everything is equal? Your history is good for you, and my history is good for me, and somebody else's history is good for somebody else. Does that establish equality? No, it doesn't establish equality. Two reasons why. One is that the question of empirical basis of your history is still crucial. Although the postmodernists have dismissed the question of empirical basis, they have argued that all history is construction of the historian, and therefore there is no empirical basis, or the empirical basis of one is as good as that of another. Sir Geoffrey Elton called these postmodernists a little harshly as the drug dealers, dealing in drugs. But that's a little harsh. They also have one point, namely that this notion of one objective history is not valid. That point is still valid. That's still taken. But otherwise, all history is among all the pluralist versions of history, or all of them are equal? No, there is the question of empirical basis. Historical evidence still remains crucial to the discipline. That's number one. And therefore, how much of historical evidence, what kind of historical evidence, what kind of understanding of historical, all of these are important. And number two, the significance of your notion of history, significance of your theory of history or understanding of history or interpretation of history, the social significance of it, the social meaning of it. What does it mean for society? Does your history writing communalize society or secularize society? Does your history understanding of history take society, our society, back into the Middle Ages or ancient period, or does it take us forward into the 21st century, 22nd century? So the meaning of history remains important. The social meaning of history remains important, and therefore all history is not equal. All interpretations, all versions of history are not important. And finally, let me say that after all this, let me say that, in a way, we are moving into a very fascinating new era, as it were, of the discipline of history. And that is when the so-called scientific history which was not scientific history at all in the 19th century, objective history and so on, not scientific at all. We are now moving into real scientific history. And that real scientific history is, we are moving into the study of, in a way, also real universal history. Unlike either Saint Augustine's universal history or Marx's universal history, we are now moving into a real universal history, real scientific history, and that is the history of humanity, humanity as such, the whole of humanity. And DNA as a science is a very powerful tool which is leading us to the study of humanity, the history of humanity as a whole, rather than of this section or that segment, and so on and so forth, and in a very scientific, completely scientific manner. And the second direction in which we are moving, which is also universal, which is also scientific, very, very scientific, is the history of the climate. There are many, many works, wonderful works written recently on the history of forests, on the history of oceans, on the history of geological history, where the question of climate change has led many, many historians, professional historians, like Dipesh Chakravarti has marvelous book called The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. He's not talking of world history, it's planetary history, history of the planet as such. This is history in its totality, this is history, scientific history, and this is universal history. It's that in that direction that the discipline is now moving. And therefore, it's the discussion of whether it was the Muslims had oppressed the Hindus or not, and how the Hindus had resisted the Muslim oppression, etc., etc. We are still bogged down in that, where the rest of the world is moving to a fantastic new world of history that was beyond 40 years ago. So it's a wonderful new world which is opening up, and therefore it's young people like you who will take the discipline of history forward into this new world which is opening up. Thank you very much, young people, and I also see some old people also. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening to me so patiently. Yes. Thank you very much. I hope there are questions.
Yes, Professor, thank you so much. It was wonderful listening to you, and especially the last end note was genuinely very intriguing and inspiring. We have several questions. I would like to hand over to Soumya first. We've got a question from the department and Dasta beforehand, and I would like to ask Soumya to please go ahead with that question.
Thank you, Shrishti. Hello, Professor.
Thank you.
So our question to you is, we have seen.
Sorry, your voice is not very clear. I think everybody else should unmute the. Yeah, now perhaps yes.
Yes. Yes, thank you. So our question to you, Professor, is like we have seen the emergence and counter-emergence of various intellectual thoughts in the process of evolution of the discipline of history. So, Professor, according to you, would you identify as the dominant intellectual school in the discipline in the current time period? Or fundamentally speaking, is there any school of thought that can be called as a dominant one?
As a the large one, dominant one.
As a dominant one, yeah.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, I think the Rankian school still remains dominant in not everywhere. Obviously, it can't be everywhere. Obviously, but it still remains dominant in many parts of the world. Many universities in the world, because this notion of history as an objective reality, as an objective truth. This notion of history has starting with positivism, very greatly reinforced by Marxism, has remained with and the notion of scientific history. This honorific scientific adds lots of prestige to. There is a world conference of historians called World Conference of or World Congress or World Conference of Historical Sciences. It's still called Historical Sciences. So the notion of science is a very powerful notion, and science means objective. So this notion still remains dominant. But then it has also been, it has been challenged, of course, very successfully challenged, particularly by anal historiography and later on by postmodernist philosophy, not historiography. It has been challenged. So I would say, since you are asking me which is the dominant school, I think overall I would still say with a little bit of unhappiness in my tone that it's still the Rankian school of objective history, scientific history. But it has been challenged very powerfully, and it's still. But once again, the point in which I ended, we are coming back to scientific history in a very scientific sense, not in the sense in which Ranke had used it, or others had used it in the Rankian sense in the 19th century, but in the real use of science as such, like in DNA, like in the study of oceans, like in the study of climate and so on and so forth, real science. So now we are moving towards a real scientific history. Yes.
Thank you for the answer, Professor. We've got another question from two of the participants, Unnati and Srishti, and their question relates to the interdisciplinary nature of or the interdisciplinary approach towards the study of history. What are your thoughts upon the same? How do you see this interdisciplinary approach, wherein you are also seeing, like through the new education policy, the ruling elite or the ruling regime trying to make several reforms in it and trying to make the nature of the discipline interdisciplinary nature, maybe in connection with like political science. So, how do you see it? Is it beneficiary for the academic rigor, or it just it just dilutes the seriousness or the sincerity of the discipline?
Well, the notion of interdisciplinary history began with anal historiography. In 1929, when they launched the journal Annales d'Histoire, Économie, Société, Annals of History, annals of history, economy, society, civilizations, etc. There was a small preface to it, a small, what shall I say, editorial, small one-page editorial to it, which said that, which made 2 points. One is that, one, we have confined history to a very narrow lane, and the other is that they put it very poetically, that each one of us is tilling our own field, while the one is tilling one field, another is tilling another field, etc., etc. But we don't look over our boundaries and look at the field that the other neighbor is tilling. What they meant was that each one of us has very narrow specialization. History is history, sociology is sociology, anthropology is anthropology, and economy is economy, economics is economics, psychology is psychology. We have no interaction with the other disciplines, which is very sad. The other is within the discipline of history itself. There are specializations. Once again, ancient, medieval, and modern. Once again, economic history, social history, political history, etc. All of these specializations, they draw very strict boundaries, and therefore they pleaded that we must break these boundaries and look over our boundaries and look at the other disciplines. And they were particularly grateful to Durkheim. They acknowledged their debt to Durkheim's sociology. Durkheim's sociology leads to the study of structures, not segments but structures. And the work of Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, it was a study of structures, structures of economy, structures of society, structures of minds, structures of culture, structures of religions, and so on and so forth. So they were in a way the pioneers of interdisciplinary history. Some of the themes that they write in the beginning itself, they introduced were. Let me just mention two themes. One is the theme of the Marc Bloch's first book was The Royal Touch, in English, Royal Touch. What is a royal touch? The royal touch is, you believe that, some believe that saints can cure you, a saint's breath can cure you of disease, or a touch of his tomb can cure or give you sons when you have had 6 daughters, or a king's breath can either cure you or give you a boon of good crops, etc., etc. These were social beliefs. So it was a royal touch, the social belief in the king's ability to cure you, to give you boon, to give you this, that, and the other. What was the meaning of this? Why did society have this belief? So his first book was on this royal touch, not on politics, not on society, well, in a way on society, but on the structure of this belief, social structure of this belief. Why did society need this kind of belief? And Lucien Febvre's famous article is called Sense and Sensibilities. So they were looking at which really is not just such a historical subject, but also necessarily would involve psychology, social anthropology, cultural anthropology, and so on and so forth. So they were in a way the pioneers of that. Interdisciplinary study is not introduced by studying interdisciplinary history in your 10th class. You have a bit of history, a bit of political science, a bit of economics, and so on and so forth. At the school level, you study, but that doesn't make history and interdisciplinary history. That doesn't. What makes history interdisciplinary or any other? What makes interdisciplinary history is the nature of your theme, the nature of your problematic, the nature of the problem that you are trying to understand, and that problem itself can involve the study of psychology, the study of economy, study of social anthropology particularly, and so on and so forth. What the present regime is doing is, present regime basically wants us to go back to James Mill kind of Hindu period, Muslim period, British period, which we have left far behind. 70 years ago, we have left it behind. But they want to take us back because that's what their politics is. They want us to think only in terms of Hindu and Muslim and not in terms of all these grand kind of themes that I have been talking of in the last 1 hour or so. None of these, only think of Hindu and Muslim. So their interdisciplinarity is also Hindu and Muslim rather than interdisciplinary history. There is no interdisciplinary history there. Yes.
Thank you for the answer, sir. Now, sir, we have another question from a participant, Mr. Keshav Bansal. He asks, are history and memory mutually exclusive and in fundamental opposition? And if history is a discourse that is antithetical and suspicious of spontaneous memory?
Fantastic question. Good. One lovely question. Well, Jacques Legoff, the great French historian, has a book called History and Memory. And recently, Sage Publications have launched a journal called Memory Studies. So that memory as a discipline, almost as a discipline, is being encouraged, recognized and encouraged at the highest level, at the level of Jacques Legoff on one hand and Sage Publications on the other hand. So memory is a very powerful, what shall I say, emerging discipline. Now, is it coterminous? Is it compatible? Is it antithetical to history? That's in a way the question that has been asked. Well, in a way, history itself is memory. History. What is history? History is what has come to. What is archives? Archives is records. Some recorders' memory of what had taken place at one time. Whether this memory is his personal memory or it is memory is recovered through other records, past records, etc., etc. History, in a way, is memory, recorded memory. Now, the question that has been asked implies whether memory and history, recorded history, are they contradictory to each other, antithetical to each other? Well, history comes to us in many forms. History comes to us through archives. History comes to us through archaeology. History comes to us through coins. History comes to us through literature. Literature as history is a very beautiful new concept which has emerged. This history not as a source of history, but literature not as a source of history, but literature as history. And you have, therefore, everything is as history, climate as history, paintings as history. They give you a history, not history of painting, but painting is history, encompasses history in some ways. So all of it is in a way memory as well as history. So it depends really on whether you use memory as antithetical to history or you use it as compatible to history. It really depends. Let me give you one very recent example. Again, Ram Janmabhoomi. There is no historical evidence that there existed a Ram temple which was demolished by Babur to build the mosque. No historical evidence or archaeological evidence. But it's also true, in 1822, one Daroga of Daroga Adalat, one Fazullah, I think, had entered a document in the Faizabad court. By then it was British court. Faizabad court, written in Persian language. But that document says that Babri Masjid is adjacent to, I'm sorry, not Babri Masjid. He's talking of Ram Janam Sthan. Babri Masjid is located adjacent to Ram Janam Sthan. That he writes in Persian script, but calls it Ram Janam Sthan. Ram Janam Sthan, Ram, who was the son of Dashrath, like in any legal document. And next to it is Sita ki Rasoi, Sita, who was the wife of Ram, the above said Ram. Like that, there is this document. This is 1822. So this is the first documentary evidence recognizing the Ram Janam Sthan somewhere in that complex. Now, what does it tell us, this document? That a popular memory had begun to grow that this was the Ram Janam Sthan where Babri Masjid was. Still, Babri Masjid is not associated with the demolition of Babri Masjid is not, demolition of Ram Janam Sthan is not associated with the erection of Babri Masjid, But that there is the Babri Masjid and there is the Ram Janam Sthan. The place which is called Ram Janam Sthan comes to be recognized in popular memory as a particular place. This popular memory then, there are lots of history about it, I don't want to go into that, but until the 19th century, mid-19th century, this association of Ram Janam Sthan and Babri Masjid had not been established. In fact, late 19th century, it had not been established. But gradually in the 19th century, the two came to be established in popular memory. And that's why first in 1822, there is a recognition of Ram Janam Sthan. There is a mention of recognition of Ram Janam Sthan. Gradually, the association of Ram Janam Sthan with Babri Masjid began to grow in popular memory. And ultimately, we see what happened as a result of popular memory. Popular memory then is used against the recorded history to ultimately demolish the Babri Masjid. And we see the result. So that I gave this long example just to make the point that memory itself is a subject of study by historians. It should be a subject of study by historians as a historical subject. But memory can therefore be complementary to, because history also is in popular memory, different kind of history, different images of history. They are also history in a way, popular history. So it can be complementary to recorded history or academic history, or it can be antithetical to it. Depends on how you want to use it. The Ram Janmabhoomi movement people used popular memory as antithetical to history. Others can use it as a French historians were using memory as Jacques Laroche wrote as complementary to history rather than antithetical. So it depends on how you use it. Sorry for this very long answer. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, and especially for bringing us the notion of popular memory. So our next question comes from Ms. Ishika Manan, and she intends to know the political approach towards the study of history. And so, in context of that, it is a given fact that you have written extensively on the adverse effects that, how communal forces have on the process of history writing. So, Professor, do you see the rise of such a communal approach towards history as a response and reaction to the prevalence of an intellectual trend that was isolated from the popular sentiment of the masses?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. One, why is it echo? One, everything has history, and equally everything has politics. There can be nothing, particularly a thing like history. It can't be depoliticized. It cannot be. Politics can't really be taken away from history, or for that matter, other things. Even anything that you say, anything that you do has some kind of politics, consciously or unconsciously. When you think, the question itself, the present regime is doing this to us, using history for this purpose, is a political statement, or the present regime statement, what it is doing has a very clear political objective. So whether you write history in one manner or history in another manner has politics in it nonetheless. Anything to do with society has politics in it. Economics has politics in it. Physics has politics in it. Why do you need to make atom bombs? It has politics in it. Why do you need to? Why has this? Why do pandemics spread? It has politics in it. How do you deal with these pandemics? It has politics in it. So there is nothing which can be divested of politics. So politics is there in everything. We must understand that. Therefore, it depends on what kind of politics is there. What kind of politics is your preference? What kind of politics do you want to subscribe to? Each one of us has to decide on what kind of politics we want. The present regime has decided, has declared, it's not merely decided, it has declared what kind of politics it wants through history. It really is up to us to challenge that. If you feel like, if you are convinced, to question that kind of politics, or question any kind of politics. Left politics has also been questioned, and in fact it has collapsed in a third of the world. Its politics was also questioned. So any kind of politics is questionable politics, but each one of us has to decide what kind of politics we want to associate with history, or for that matter, with any aspect of our life.
Thank you for the precise answer, Professor. Yes, now I would like to ask Jacinta to please give a formal thank you note